Thank you, Benny. Good morning. It's great to see such a great crowd with us today. If you're visiting with us, we want you to know you're our honored guest. We're glad that you're here. Come back and be with us anytime that you can. Well, I know we have a number of people that are joining us online as well, and we're glad that you're with us this morning. We just read a statement of Paul that was written to the Corinthians. The Corinthians are just a small drive down the road from the topic of our conversation today. We're going to be in Acts chapter 17. If you have your Bibles, open up to that passage. It's been quite a year. About a little over a year ago, Jim Pollard and Randy Jones and I were in Greece. When we went over there, we saw a number of different things, and you guys didn't get much of a report because when we came home, a lot of different things happened. But I've got a couple pictures I want you to see because I think it'll set the stage for what we're going to see in Acts chapter 17. When you go to Greece, you go from town to town and you see what the culture in Paul's day in Acts chapter 17 was like. And what you see is that there are gods, lowercase g, everywhere when it comes to this Greek culture. As soon as we got there, we left the airport and we took up the coast and we saw this first picture. They took us to the area. You can see the ocean over to the left in the background, but that temple behind us was a temple to Poseidon. And they put it right out on the coast because that's where all of the boats that were coming across the Mediterranean as they came into Athens, they would pass by this temple. And what did they want? They wanted the god of the sea to be happy with them as they traveled. So as they came or as they were leaving, they would sit there, and many people, before they took off on their trip, would go to this temple and they would, offer their sacrifices or give their gifts to the god Poseidon. You look at the next picture, and this was going to be in Corinth. If you backed up, you see this other god is going to be serving the god Apollo. And that was one of the temples that they had. But as you look in the ruins of these cities, they dig them up and they found temples everywhere that you went. You would find the gods that they served. Now these people put some serious time and effort into these type structures. I like our facility. I have no anticipation that this facility and these materials are going to be hanging around 1,000 years from now, much less 2,000 years later. But these people, as they served their gods, this wasn't just something that was a one-off. This was unbelievable amounts of time, money, effort. We traveled through the countryside, and you went to Delphi, which they called was the navel of the world, and they went to where so many different people, the Emperor Nero, other commanders, before they would go into battle, they came there because they believed that there was an oracle that was there that would tell them about what was going to happen, about their future, about whether or not they would have success. It was infused into their life, this idea of all of these gods, and we know of many of the stories of Greek mythology. But they were stories of myths, stories that had been made up, and it was really interesting as Dino took us around, the missionary that we support in Greece, as he took us around, as he told us the history of their country. Even today, the history of their country is mixed in with all of these oral stories of what happened. And a lot of them were myths and all the different things that had happened with the gods. Well, the next picture that you see is the location of the speech that we're going to hear today. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is going to be in Athens, and he has basically he sort of escaped for his life out of Macedonia, north of Athens. He's come down into Athens, and while he is there, he's waiting on his travel companions, and he's looking around, seeing all these different things that are happening. The hill that you see there, directly in front of you is the Areopagus. If you're looking in your King James, maybe New King James, it would say Mars Hill. What was Areopagus? It was the hill of Mars, or the hill of Ares. It was the god of war. This is the hill, that's what they called there. It was connected to their god. As you look up on the hill, you're going to see the hill in the background is the Acropolis, where you're going to find the Parthenon. We have ours in Nashville. But this was the original. You go to the next picture, you see some of the ruins that they've stood back up, and you see that massive structure, one of those wonders of the ancient world, which was the Parthenon. It was built in 432 BC. Massive. And you can see the hill. They had to carry everything that they were going to use to build that temple. They had to carry it up that hill and set it up. And this overlooks all of Athens, and it overlooks the water in the bay. And this was what Athens was known for, was the god Athena, this goddess of wisdom. But the Greeks had a god for everything. You're going to have Zeus, the god of the sky, and you're going to have Poseidon, the god of the sea. You were going to have the god of war. You were going to have Hades. You had 12 main gods that they would look to. But when you continue on with their story, I looked on one website where I counted over 61 different gods that the Greeks would believe in, whether it was gods or demigods or half gods that they would serve, and that's what their life was all about. Well, as Paul is sitting here in Athens, he sees all of this, and it just brings about a response in his life. It brings about that he couldn't just sit there. He was waiting on some of his other travel companions to come on, but as he continued to look around, he just couldn't hold it in anymore. He saw this entire city that's given to idolatry, and he says, I want you to know about the one God. And that's what we've come to within our series as we've looked at the idea of trying to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. In Ephesians chapter 4, the last one that Paul is going to give us is that there is one God and Father who is above all and through all and in you all. And this one God is what was going to draw everybody together. And what I'm going to do with that, with this final one, is we're going to spend this morning talking about the one God, and then tonight we're going to talk about how He is a Father. So we're going to have it in two different lessons. But what I want us to do is basically look at the story that we see that takes place here at the Acropolis. The next picture is a picture of our missionary, Dino Zanetos. Behind him is the passages that we're going to read today. Now, as for my part, it was Greek to me, but what you look there is it's all written in Greek. We're going to read it in English. I think that'd be a little bit easier. But that is mounted there, this huge plaque on the side of that hill. And it's an amazing thing to stand there and think, okay, this area, that little rock area that you had in front of you, Paul comes up, he has all these people gathered around him, and he wants to tell them about the one God, but everywhere you look, he's surrounded by their idea of God. What did it do? It spread them all over the city. What was he wanting to do? Tell them about the one God that brings us all together. Let's read the passage this morning. We're going to begin in Acts chapter 17, verse 16. It says, Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Like we had mentioned, he had just gotten out of Macedonia. He came there, and as he came, he saw all these temples. He saw all the idolatry that was going on. He saw what was happening, but as he, as a Christian, as a believer, he said, look, I've got to talk to other people about that. And the first place that he goes to are the Jews. The Jews at least believed in the one God. You have to understand the culture of that day. And when people in Greece, when people in Athens were going to look at Jews, and later on as they would look at Christians, you believe in one God? They would almost call them atheists. You're pretty much an atheist if you only like one. We have all these gods and you don't believe in anything but one. But as Paul sees that, he goes and talks to the Jews and he's going to tell them about Jesus. He's talking to other individuals as well, and you just see that he's moved and he has to start talking about people. And he's not just stating facts, he's reasoning with people. He says, look, I want you to think about your life, and I want you to think about these things. And as he talks to the Jews, he has that common ground. They already believe in one God. But other people are listening to him as well. And look at what it says in verse 18. He says, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. So he comes in, and there, you have Aristotle, you have all these other philosophers. Athens was known for their great philosophy, and these Epicureans and these Stoics say, okay, well, this guy seems pretty smart. He's talking about a lot of different stuff, but I don't know what exactly he's talking about. It's almost like he's talking about foreign gods. So he said, I'll tell you what, we're going to give you a hearing. We want you to come up to the Areopagus, that area there that we saw where the Parthenon's in the background, to this hill of Mars. And we're going to let you come, and this is a time where we can have a lot of different discussions, and we want you to present to us an idea about this God that you're talking about. And he gets that invitation. Verse 20 says, you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and foreigners who live there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. See, they serve the goddess of wisdom in their mind, and what they always wanted to know was just, hey, what's new? That was just the saying in Athens is, what's new? We just want to talk about ideas, talk about thoughts, and here's a different idea. So here, Paul, present to us the idea of your one God. And he gets that special invitation to go there. Well, Paul wants to show them the error of idolatry, but what he really wants to tell them about is the one God. And that's what we want to think about. And what I want us to do is look at this story and then say, okay, what does this tell us about the one God? And then also, as we consider this story as we close, I want us to think about what does it tell us about man as well. So Paul gets up and he begins his sermon in verse 22. Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as the unknown, this I proclaim to you. He begins his lesson by saying, I see that you're very religious. The word there, we're not exactly sure which one it means. Some of your versions will say that you are very superstitious. That would sort of be a negative connotation to it. Another way that you could put that is what we have is as you're very religious. I see that you believe in a lot of different stuff. We don't know exactly what way that he's coming across, but he says, look, I know that you guys believe a lot of different things. So much so that as I was walking through your area, I found an altar and it was made out to the unknown God. This wasn't the only place that would happen. There were other cities in the ancient world that would have an altar there as well, because when you have so many gods, that's going to lead to paranoia. Okay, well, we know these, but what if there's some more? So what did they do? They would just build an altar, and it was to the unknown God, because in their mind, if some other God shows up and he comes down and he's getting onto us, where's my altar? Oh, we've got yours. It's right here. We'll just scribble unknown off. We'll put your name on it. Here it is. So they were worshiping everything, and just in case we forgot one, we're worshiping to the unknown God. And Paul says, that's the one I want to tell you about. I want to tell you, in case you haven't, the one that you have missed is the one that you need to know. I want to tell you about the true God. And then he gives this beautiful proclamation of the one God that brings us all together. Verse 24, he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by hands, made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods in the boundaries of their dwelling place. When we think about the one God that we have, he comes and tells them, he says, our God, our one God made the world. When we think about what draws us together, we know the origin of where we come from. There are so many people today that have no idea, or they're listening to whatever a scientist is going to tell them, and you came from certain cells or you came from animals, and what happens is we think we came from animals. What keeps us from acting like animals? But instead, Paul says the one God is the creator of everything. It answers the mystery of our existence. He says in verse 26 that of one man he made everyone. That establishes Adam, and the story that we see in Genesis chapter 1. It's not a myth. It's not just an allegory to sort of tell about an idea. No, God made one man, and God made one woman. And that was the beginning of time. The story that we read at the beginning is the foundation for who we are. And he says he made of this one man everyone. When you think about that principle, what does it do? It eliminates the basis for racism. We all come from all places. So it doesn't matter what our background is, doesn't matter what we look like, what do we know? We have one common Father, we have one common Creator, and every race on this planet all came from the same individual. So we see that man is valued not based on what we look like on the outside, but what God has placed on the inside, and He's given us His Spirit. He says He is the Lord of heaven and earth. We're used to hearing that. They're not. For him, he starts talking about things that sort of rocks their world. Hold up, no, we have a god of the sky. His name is Zeus. And we have other gods that are going to rule different aspects here on earth. But he says, no, there is one God, and he is the God of everything. He's going to be the God of the sea. He's going to be the God of the sky. He's going to be the God of this life, the afterlife. He's going to be the God of everything. He is the all-encompassing I am. He then goes on to tell him, our God doesn't live in a temple. And I've often thought of Paul standing there on the hill, and as he's just looking around, he says, our God doesn't live in a temple. You can't build a house for him. The city was sitting there and had lived in the shadow of that Parthenon for over 400 years. That is what they were known for. And as they look up there and see it, he says, look, our God doesn't need that. You can't build a house for him. We've already seen what he's going to tell us in Ephesians. Where is God's temple? It's in us. It's in the church. He's built us up based on what Jesus has done to be a temple for him. And we go out into the world and we're going to be a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. And he says, look, the God that I'm telling you about doesn't live in a location, nor does he need man to serve you. See, that city had been totally confused about what God was all about. They had lived there in the shadows of that. That's what they were used to. That wasn't the only temple by any means. Petronius was a man that served in the court of Nero. And he said satirically, he said, it's easier to find a god in Athens than a person. You know, they were used to gods everywhere. And how did they represent that? They were going to build an altar. They were going to build a temple. And that's what was going on. And that's what their life was all about. But here he says, our God doesn't live in a temple, because we are his temple. Our God doesn't need anything as if he needs to serve us. And you think about all the work and all the time for over 400 years. They had to go in there and they had that huge statue of Athena. But those torches would let off fuel. She'd eventually get covered with soot. What were they going to have to do? They were going to have to go in there and clean her. They were going to have to sweep that area out. They were going to have to come and rebuild it and do repairs and do all of this work. They spent untold energy, time, money serving their God. And Paul says, our God doesn't need a house. He's made this world. He doesn't need us to serve him. We don't have to clean him off. We don't have to maintain replicas of his image. Our God is greater than that. Our God is not dependent on our gifts. We don't get to choose what we're going to give him and what we're going to decide that he is worthy of. He gave us everything. The question is, are we going to give our lives back to him? But this idea of one God changes the paradigm of their life. They thought, look, we've got to make every God for every aspect of my life happy. And they were constantly chasing all these different things, hoping that the gods would bless them. But he comes in and says God is sovereign. What did he say? He's not served by human hands as though he needed anything. He has made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. He said not only did God make the world, but he made the place, and God has a plan. And God is sovereign over this plan. You think you are great. Well, you had all the different empires that were going through, and at one point there had been this Greek empire, and then the Romans came, and there was going to be the Roman Empire, and there was other ones at other times in history. But Paul says this one God made the world, and he's decided where you're going to be, why you're going to be there, and he has set a place and a time for each and every individual on earth. That he is the one that is in control. He decides what governments come and go. He's in control of where mankind has lived throughout all time. Well, why is that the case? You see the answer in verse 27. He did all of this, and he continues to do it today, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he's actually not far from each one of us. Ultimately, God's desire is that mankind will seek for him. We'll look for him. Here you have this idea of you're sort of, somebody that's in the dark, or you got somebody and they've got this, bandana over their eyes, and they're reaching out and they're groping to see whether they can find him. And he says, you know what happens? God puts certain things in our lives and puts us in certain situations. If somebody's wanting to seek him, he's going to set up the situations in our life that when that honest heart is wanting to seek him, God's desire is that they will find him. He says his desire is that we seek and find him, but actually what I want you to know is that he is near to all of us. Paul then goes and he doesn't decide to quote from the Old Testament. He doesn't give them scriptures, but what he does is he quotes from one of their poets. Epimenides of Crete wrote a song to Zeus, to their god, and Paul uses this line. He's going to quote a line from something that they're familiar with. 2 verses later in the same song is what he quotes in Titus chapter 1, verse 2. But he says these 2 lines in verse 28. He says, "For in him we live and move and have our being. Even as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." He says, look, what we don't do is we don't get to go and visit God because he's in one specific temple. It's not that God comes and we have to give him service because he is dependent on us to have all of his needs met. It's not that we can go to a specific place. We have a God who is all around us. In him we live, we move, and have our very being. Every day that you get up, you're going to be in the presence of God. Everywhere that you go, you're going to be right there with him. As David said, can I flee from his presence? There's no chance. The story of Jonah was confused. He thought that he could get away from where God was. But what we see is we have one God who is with us. While we are together here, God is with us. As soon as you get in your car, God is still with us. As soon as you go home, God is with you then. Everywhere we go, in every situation, in every dealings of life, we have a God who we are right there with him, because in him we live and we move and we have our very being. They thought about the offsprings of the God like Hercules or certain individuals that would come and have special things. But he says, no, actually, we are his offspring. We are the children of God. And tonight we'll look at what he means when he says that we have one God and one Father. So not only is the God the creator of everything, not only has God set up the allotted times and he is sovereign over everything that happens, he does it because he wants us to seek him. And what we need to understand is sometimes we're wondering, okay, where is he? But what the true reality of our one God is, he is all around us in everything that we do. He then leads them to a logical conclusion in verse 29. He says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. He says, look around at us. And you think about individuals today, when you look at the world and you look at the evidence of God, you see the beauty of the spring coming alive. You see all the things that he's done as a created being. He says, look at yourself. You, as you look in the mirror, is the greatest reason you ought to believe in God. We're his children. He's made us, and he has made us with unbelievable bodies and unbelievable abilities to see, to hear, to record information, to memorize it in our brain, to go and feel all the emotions that we have. He has made you in every way. So why in the world would you reduce what you're going to serve to a rock, to a piece of gold, some kind of silver? You're going to let those things be your master. He says, look, that doesn't even make sense. Logically, it's not going to go together. That, look, you're going to make some image that is going to be your God. The God that created us is so much greater than any of the things that you've looked at. I think it's important for us to see there as well what really happened with those idols is they decided that they got to pick their God. They got to create him. What did he say? Oh, some man was going to make a determination. They said, well, what does Athena look like? And they went around and said, well, whoever is the best sculptor in the room is going to tell us what Athena looks like. And that was what her image was going to be like. And as they made other copies of that, man decided what every god looks like. And that's not the way that God works. God is God and we are not. We don't get to tell God what morality is. We don't get to tell God what is right or wrong. We don't get to come and say, look, this is what God wants. This is what God deserves. We come and see who God is, and we respond our life to what he has done and who he is. It's not our job to sit there and decide what God is going to be. Many people today have made a God that just mirrors the society and the culture of the day. Well, God is always changing. Well, for the Athenians, what were they doing with their idols? They were going to make their gods be what they wanted them to be. Well, Paul has now told them about the one God, and now he's going to challenge them. Verse 30, he said, the times of ignorance God has overlooked. They didn't know who the true God was, but now you know who the one God is. Now you have the information. The time when you didn't know the information, that was one thing, and God had overlooked that. But now, he says, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Why? Because he's fixed a day on which he'll judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. He's given us assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So Paul comes and says, here's the one God. Here's some of the information you need to know about who he is, what he has created, the power that he has, and what he has called you to do. You need to know that he is right here with you, but you know what he expects now? He expects you to respond to the knowledge that you have. And what are you going to need to do? You're going to need to repent. Why? Because judgment's coming. And how do we know this? How can we establish this? Paul says, because I've gone and talked to the individuals who saw the risen Lord. God has overlooked your past up till today, but what are you called to do? Today, if you hear his voice and you know who he is, then you need to change. Ignorance, not knowing, is no longer an excuse. And he commands people everywhere to repent because that day of judgment is coming. Well, let's look at some questions we can ask from what we've seen within the story. What do we learn about God? I've got 4 very quick things as we see when you look at this lesson, and Paul presenting it. It's very interesting as you sit there and consider, what would you do when you talk to somebody who knows nothing about God? What exactly would you tell them? And he had this great opportunity. I'm so glad that this sermon is laid out for us because it's things that I think are important for us to talk about. We have to understand now, I think it was about a month ago, I read an article that the majority of Americans are now not going to worship. Used to be 70, used to be even, I remember 80% of people would say that they were going to worship on a regular basis. 47% was the Gallup poll that I saw of people who were going to be involved in going to worship God. You know what that means? There's going to be a ton of children who have no idea who he is. We have people that move to our community. You're going to have people and neighbors that don't know the basics that we just looked at. They haven't thought about that and considered it. And we're going to have opportunities like Paul did to sit there and tell them about God. Well, what do we learn? We see that God is the creator. God is the creator. And as people ask, why would you believe in him? I believe it's fair to say, well, look around. Look at life. Look at the cycle of the seasons. Look at our own lives. Look in the mirror and see the most amazing camera you can ever find. If only we could imagine the fact that we put food into our bodies and it powers this computer that is our brain, that we can bring up stories from 20, 30, 50 years ago immediately. All the things that God has done. He has created us. Whenever you see a beautiful picture, you know it has a painter. When we see this world, we know that it has a creator. The same God who made everything, he also says that he'll care for us. What else do we see within the sermon about God? He doesn't need our service. He doesn't need us to take care of him and his dwelling place. He calls us to service, but he calls us to what? Serve our fellow man. To love him, and if we love him, we're going to love those around us, and we're going to take care of them. Our God doesn't need our service, but he invites us to come and know him and serve him, because what does he know? In doing so, we're going to find our real purpose. When you leave this week, if you're doing what God has called you to do, you're going to find your fulfillment if you decide to serve him. We've also seen within this a fact about God that he's close to us. In him we live, we move, we have our very being. We can't run from his presence, nor can we be taken from his hand. Regardless of where we go and what emotions we're feeling, regardless of what blessings or hardships we're dealing with, whenever we walk through grief, when we walk through sorrow, when we walk through our daily lives, we have a God who is right there with us. And finally, I think we learn that he is in control. Our God is in control. He's appointed those allotted times. He's decided where we're going to be. And we're blessed to be here this morning. If you're here this morning, if you are here, you know that you're in the right place. You're in the exact place God would have you to be. Thinking about him, hearing about his word, getting an opportunity to make choices about what he has done for you. God's in control. Now, when you think about that, it doesn't always appear that way. I figure that the apostles really wondered, as they saw Jesus dragged off by a crowd of soldiers, that God was in control. Because in this world, it doesn't always look like that. Hardships come. grief and pain and difficulty and sickness and all these other things happen. And sometimes we sit here and wonder about whether or not is God really in control of what is happening. But we have to remind ourselves, God's goal for our lives is not our comfort, our ease of life. God's goal for our life is not even an absence of pain and suffering. Why? Because we all know and understand as we deal with difficulties, many times that's when we seek Him in a more important way. Many times as we deal with those hardships and we know that, look, I'm not in control of any of these things, it draws us closer to Him. He wants us to seek Him above all else, and He's told us that if we'll seek Him, then we'll find Him. And the peace that His presence brings will bless us in any situation. Well, what do we learn about man? As we went all over the country of Athens, I thought about all of those temples that people had built. The architecture was amazing, but the size of those pillars that they put together were huge. How in the world without a crane? How in the world without an electric jack? How did they go to a quarry and just start chiseling out with a hammer and a chisel and make all of these things? And just to make one of them that had to weigh 800 pounds, and that was one section of one pillar that they then had to put up 50 feet in the air. What had they done? They had spent all kinds of time, all kinds of money, all kinds of energy into all of these things. Why? Because that was the pride of their life. They wanted to build something that would give honor to these idols, to these gods, because they were hoping that they would be blessed. And what does it scream out? It screams out another evidence of our one God. Man has just been made to serve masters. Those people had made up stories. They had a desire to say, there's got to be something greater than us. There's something that has more power than us. There's something that we need something outside of us to bless us. And they had made up stories in order to do it, and had spent all of that time. But you see that they were made to serve masters, and I believe it's true for us as well. We don't build a temple. We don't go and serve many idols. That's not common in our culture, but we have all kinds of things that we give our time to. We have all kinds of things that we'll pour money into time and time again. We have things in our life that each one of us make a choice this week. Where are you going to spend your energy? How much energy are you going to give the different aspects of life? Where are you going to give your money? Where are you putting your pride? What are you most excited about in life? And as we ask that question, we're going to be able to find our master. Sometimes it's just our selfish desires. Sometimes we're confused as well, and we're chasing things that we know in the long term aren't going to add up. But we're made to serve masters. I believe another thing you see there is we like to be in control of them. See, the Greeks gave their masters their gods' names. They gave them images. They made up their stories. They built them those temples. They made up what those gods liked. They made up what their gods didn't like. They made up how they were going to serve them. They wanted to be in control of their gods. And we also decide, what are we going to serve? What are we going to do? We want to be in control of our masters. But many times Satan fools us into thinking in this world that we're in control, but really we never are. Romans chapter 6, verse 16 tells us this. He says, "Do you not know that when you present yourself to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either sin, resulting in death, or of obedience, resulting in righteousness?" He says, look, in our lives we make a decision. What are you going to serve? And whenever you decide you're going to obey something, whether it's your job or whether it's your desires or whether it's the things that you want or whether it's more money or more possessions or whether it's just going to be the pride of having people look at you and like you, whatever you give your time, energy, money, and service to, that is what is in control of you. He goes on and talks about how Christians have left sin, this former master, in order to serve the one God, the real master. But he says this, and he asks a great question. He says in verse 21 of Romans 6, "Therefore, what benefit were you deriving from the things which you are now ashamed? For the outcome of those things is death. But now, having been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit, resulting in sanctification, and the outcome, eternal life. See, people think, and we're tempted to think, look, whenever I do all these things, when I decide my time, when I decide my energy, when I decide what I'm going to do with my efforts, we think that we're in control. Many people in this world are saying, look, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Whatever feels right is going to be. Whatever I decide is right, that's what's right. Whatever morals I decide are good or bad, that's what's going to be what rules me. And ultimately, what are they saying? My life is controlled by my finite mind, by my limited experience, by what I feel is right in this moment of time. And Satan has them right where he wants them. He wants them trusting how we feel, based on what we see and what we know. He wants us to think we're in control of our masters. But eventually materialism fades. Popularity isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Power corrupts. Desires are never finally or fully satisfied. And then you're back to wondering what life's all about. Many of the people that have gone down those roads have found all the potholes, and eventually they find a dead end. So the question that we have of who is the master of your life, or what ground are you on, is one of the most important things that we would have. And I believe that's the last thing we learn about mankind, is we have to make a choice. Who or what will we serve? So I ask you this morning, what are you spending your time on? What are you spending your energy on? What are you most proud of? What's the most important thing in your life today? There's only one thing that's worthy of all that time and energy, and that's the one God. And that's why he says, if we're going to be unified, what brings us all together is saying, look, there's nothing else in this life that's going to be important to me than my relationship with God. That's going to be number one. It's more important than my relationship with my spouse. It's more important even than my children, my job, my energy, where I spend my money. None of those things matter in relationship to how much I love God. And I'm going to put that absolutely first. And you know what happens? It's like a magnet that draws everybody in when God is number one in our life. And that's what Paul has called us to do. The one God that we serve will draw us together. Why? We have the same master, the same creator. We know he's going to lead us. He's going to take care of us. He is right there with us everywhere we go, and we're going to give him all that we have. So the question is, what choice do we make? In verse 32, it says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Others said, we'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some of the men joined and believed, and among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with him. Here you see that people made their choice, and that's the challenge for us this morning, is to make the choice. Which is your choice? You saw within the verse that what some people did is they mocked it and said, whatever, I'm done. I ain't listening to that. As soon as they heard about the resurrection from the dead, I just can't see it. I cannot believe that there's something going to be beyond this life. And they just walked away. They made fun of it all and they weren't interested. And that's the choice that people make every day. Other people said, well, it makes a little bit of sense. Not today. Maybe a little bit later. I'll consider it, and they walk off. And then you have other people who came and said, today is today. Where are you today when it comes to the one God? Are you right with him? Is he your Lord? Have you sought him? Have you found him? Is he blessing your life? Do you understand his presence and the blessing of that? Is he bringing you peace? Is he bringing you joy? Is that a part of everything that you do? If people said the number one thing in your life, are they going to point to the God, the creator of the world? That's the invitation that we have today. I want to encourage every one of us that already believe in him to continue serving him, to make that an easy question for others to answer as they watch our lives. If you need to change in order to make that happen, I encourage you to do that. But if you're here today and you haven't made the decision to follow him yet, you're making that choice. Don't mock him. Don't wait for another day. Make the choice today to serve that one God. If we can help you to that end, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.